In the winter of 1847, the Commonwealth of Virginia was already accustomed to records that did not speak plainly. County ledgers listed people as property. Church baptismal rolls recorded first names without surnames. Medical journals described bodies without biographies. Census tables counted numbers without voices. The system functioned not by telling lies, but by deciding what did not require explanation. It is within this landscape of partial truth that a particular set of documents appears quietly, inconsistently, and only if one already knows what to look for. They do not announce themselves as extraordinary. They are not marked dangerous, or confidential, or forbidden. They are labeled simply Educational Observations, Tidewater District, 1847. At first glance, they resemble nothing more than a local academic survey. Ink on brittle paper, columns ruled by hand, a sequence of numbers, abbreviations, and marginal notes. The sort of paperwork produced routinely by antebellum institutions eager to appear orderly, enlightened, and modern. But something about these pages resists easy classification. The handwriting changes midway through the ledger. Dates repeat without explanation. Ages are recorded, then crossed out, then rewritten. Names appear, disappear, and reappear with slight variations, as if the person recording them could not decide what to call the subjects or whether to acknowledge them as subjects at all. Most tellingly, the ledger does not list students. It lists units. The project that generated these records did not originate in a plantation house, nor in a courthouse, nor even in a school. It began in a medical college lecture hall, during a season when American science was attempting to define itself as rational, empirical, and distinct from both European philosophy and religious doctrine. In 1847, several Virginia institutions were engaged in an emerging debate that troubled legislators and scholars alike, whether intelligence was fixed by nature, shaped by environment, or susceptible to measurement in a reliable, standardized way. The question was not abstract. If intelligence could be measured, it could be ranked. If it could be ranked, it could be governed, and if it could be governed, it could be used to justify nearly everything already in place. Within this framework, enslaved children were not viewed as individuals to be educated, nor as souls to be saved, but as a population uniquely suited to experimentation. They were legally accessible, socially silenced, and institutionally invisible beyond their economic value. They could be tested without consent. They could be moved without record. And their results could be filed without consequence. The test itself was not called an intelligence test at the time. That term would come later. In 1847. It was referred to in correspondence as a comparative faculty assessment, a phrase deliberately vague, designed to obscure more than it revealed. It implied observation rather than intervention, measurement rather than judgment. The methodology drew from several influences: European phrenological theory, early pedagogical examinations, and military aptitude drills. But unlike the examinations given to white students or cadets, this assessment was conducted in silence, without instruction, explanation, or feedback. The children were not told what was being measured. In many cases, they were not told they were being tested at all. They were assembled in small groups, never more than 6 at a time, and brought into spaces described in the records as auxiliary rooms. These were not classrooms. They were storage, annexes, unusuables, and disused infirmary wings. Places where observation could occur without witnesses. The ages of the children ranged according to the ledger, from approximately 7 to 13. The word approximately appears often. Birth records for enslaved children were inconsistent when they existed at all. Age was inferred from size, dentition, or the testimony of overseers who had no incentive to be precise. The children's names, when recorded, appear with annotations known as answers to. Never simply is. One child appears repeatedly in the documents. Though never prominently, he is listed as Unit 14. Later, U-14. Later still. Simply 14. A marginal note beside his first entry reads, male, small stature, unusually observant. There is no surname. There is no plantation name. There is no indication of parentage. What distinguishes Unit 14 is not any single score or outcome, but the frequency with which he is reassessed. While most children appear once or twice at most, Unit 14 is evaluated across multiple dates. Sometimes only days apart. The tests administered to him are described in fragments, a sequence involving shapes carved from wood, a memory exercise using spoken numbers, delivered without rhythm or emphasis, a problem, requiring the identification of inconsistencies in a short narrative read. Allowed. This last task is unusual, narrative. Comprehension was not typically included in assessments of enslaved populations, as it presupposed literacy or abstract reasoning qualities the prevailing ideology insisted were either absent or irrelevant. And yet, the notation beside this task reads, response exceeded expectation. Subject refrained from guessing. The phrasing is careful, exceeded whose expectation, and refrained compared to what baseline. The presence of restraint is noted more than once. Several children are described as impulsive, distractible, or uncooperative. These descriptors align neatly with contemporary stereotypes and require no further explanation. Unit 14, however, is described as withholding, reserved, and slow to answer even when correct. In one entry, the observer notes delay suggests internal verification, rather than confusion. This is an extraordinary statement for the period. It implies not only reasoning but also metacognition, the awareness of one's own thought processes. Such a capacity, if acknowledged, would complicate the entire theoretical foundation upon which the institution rested. And so, the statement is not expanded upon. It is written once, and then never referenced again. The sealing of the results did not occur immediately for several months. The project appears to proceed as planned. Data is collected. Comparisons are drawn. Preliminary summaries are drafted. A letter dated March 1847 references an upcoming presentation to a regional academic society. But by late April, the tone of the correspondence shifts. Phrases like methodological inconsistency and external misinterpretation begin to appear. One letter, written in a markedly different hand, warns that certain findings, if circulated without sufficient contextual framing, may invite undesirable scrutiny. The word undesirable is underlined shortly thereafter. The project ceases. There's no formal termination notice, no declaration of failure. The records simply stop. The ledger ends. Mid-column. Unit 14's final entry is incomplete. The ink fades after the phrase subject demonstrates. And then nothing. What happened to the children after the testing is not documented. They are returned, presumably, to the system that had always claimed them. There are no notes regarding compensation, punishment, or alteration of status. Officially, Nothing has changed. Unofficially. Something has, the results are not. Destroyed. They are sealed. The documents are refiled under a different classification, one that places them outside the normal scope of educational or medical inquiry. Access requires multiple approvals. Citations to the data are prohibited without explicit authorization, and perhaps most tellingly, no similar assessment is attempted. Again in the region for decades. The silence that follows is not accidental. It is procedural. To understand why the results were sealed, one must understand what they threatened, not the notion that enslaved children could think. That had been inconveniently evident to anyone paying attention. But the possibility that their thinking could not be neatly categorized as inferior, impulsive, or deficient, the possibility that, under controlled conditions, without instruction, some demonstrated capacities that the system had spent generations denying. The ledger does not proclaim this. It does not argue. It merely records. And in doing so, it creates a problem that cannot be solved through rhetoric or punishment, only through disappearance. There is one final note in the margin of the ledger, written in pencil rather than ink. It appears to have been added later, perhaps years after the initial entries. It reads, "Recommending replication." No explanation follows. No justification is offered. The pencil mark is faint, as if the writer did not wish to leave too strong an impression, but the meaning is unmistakable. This was not a failure of science. It was a success that could not be allowed to stand. And somewhere, beyond the reach of the ledger, beyond the classifications and seals, Unit 14 continued to exist within a system that had, briefly and unwillingly, recognized something it was never meant to see and then decided, collectively, to look away. The decision to look away did not require a meeting. It required only that no one insist on continuing to look. In the months following the sealing of the records, the institutions involved behaved as though the project had simply exhausted its usefulness. Faculty correspondence returned to familiar topics. Budgets were adjusted without comment. Annual reports omitted any reference to the assessment, listing instead a vague line item for miscellaneous observational expenses. Nothing was retracted, nothing was corrected. The absence itself became the resolution, yet the ledger did not disappear entirely. It was transferred quietly from the medical college archive to a state repository, under a category reserved for materials deemed contextually sensitive. This designation did not imply danger or error. It implied inconvenience. The kind of inconvenience that arose when information existed without a socially acceptable use for decades. The ledger remained unopened, not because it was forbidden in the dramatic sense, but because there was no professional incentive to request it. Its classification ensured that it would never appear in standard indices or bibliographies. A researcher would have to know not only what they were looking for, but also why they were not supposed to find it. During this period, the science of intelligence did not stall. It advanced selectively. New theories emerged, many of them claiming greater rigor and objectivity than their predecessors. Measurements became more standardized. Terminology became more precise. Charts replaced prose. Numbers replaced observation, but one thing remained consistent. The subjects of these studies were carefully chosen: white children from controlled environments. Military recruits screened for compliance. Immigrants are evaluated at ports of entry under assumptions already hardened into policy. Enslaved children vanished from the literature. Not because they were inaccessible, but because they were no longer useful in the way the system required. The Virginia assessment had demonstrated something its designers could not reconcile: variability that did not conform to hierarchy, intelligence that did not cluster obediently at the bottom, responses that suggested internal deliberation rather than reflex. Such findings could not be integrated without destabilizing the categories themselves. And so, the categories were preserved by omission. Within the sealed ledger, there are traces of this anxiety, later annotations likely added during the reclassification process attempt to reinterpret the data. Marginal notes propose alternative explanations: environmental mimicry, observer bias, and anomalous sample selection. One note suggests that the children may have been previously exposed to instructional stimuli inconsistent with their station. The phrase is deliberately imprecise. It gestures toward contamination without specifying a source. Another note questions whether the assessment tasks themselves were culturally neutral. This is striking given that cultural neutrality had not been a stated concern during the project's design. The question appears only after the results prove troublesome. The system, confronted with unexpected competence, turns to abstraction. If the data cannot be denied, it must be. Our EFRAMED. Unit 14 continues to appear throughout these reinterpretations. Though his designation changes again, he becomes case D. Then subject D-3. Each renaming distances him further from personhood. The more closely his responses are examined, the more aggressively his identity is dissolved. Yet, even as the labels multiply, the observations remain stubbornly consistent. He exhibits delayed response patterns. He demonstrates error correction. Without prompting, he identifies contradictions. Without relying on memorized cues. At one point, an observer notes that when presented with an unsolvable problem one deliberately constructed to induce guessing, Unit 14 does not respond at all. He waits. The session ends. He is escorted out. The notation reads, absence of response may indicate refusal rather than inability. Refusal. The word sits uneasily within the margins. To refuse is to choose. And choice, in this context, is a conceptual trespass. There is no record of punishment associated with this refusal. That absence is notable. Enslaved children were routinely disciplined for far less. Silence, hesitation, or non-compliance, any of these could provoke correction. But within the assessment environment, discipline would have compromised the appearance of neutrality. The observers were committed, at least superficially, to the idea that they were measuring innate faculties, not producing them through coercion. And so, the refusal is noted but not addressed. It is allowed to exist on paper, unresolved, beyond the ledger. Life continued according to established patterns. The plantations of Tidewater, Virginia, did not alter their operations. The children returned to labor. Seasons passed. Ownership changed hands. Records were updated or lost, but the assessment had consequences that did not announce themselves within a few years. A subtle shift occurs in regional policy discussions. Proposals for limited instructional programs for enslaved children, previously justified ASA means of increasing productivity, are quietly withdrawn. Arguments that education might produce more efficient labor give way to concerns about cognitive agitation and misaligned aspiration. The language is revealing agitation implies disturbance. From a natural state, aspiration implies desire beyond assigned bounds. Neither term acknowledges capacity directly, But both assume it. The fear is no longer ignorance. It is awareness. It is tempting to imagine that Unit 14 understood the significance of what he demonstrated. There is no evidence that he did. There is no diary, no testimony, no later recollection that can be traced with certainty, but the record suggests something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling. That he did not need to understand the system to disrupt it. He only needed to respond honestly. To pause when uncertain. To refuse when the question itself was incoherent. These behaviors, mundane in another context, became intolerable within a framework that depended on predictability. The sealing of the results did not erase them entirely. Fragments resurfaced indirectly. In later decades, a statistical table published in the 1870s includes a footnote referencing prior unreplicated assessments of dependent populations, dismissed as methodologically flawed. No location is specified. No year is given. The citation leads nowhere. A lecture transcript from the 1880s warns against over-interpreting isolated instances of apparent abstraction among untrained subjects. The phrasing echoes earlier marginal notes almost verbatim. These echoes suggest not ignorance, but memory. The system remembers what it has chosen to forget. In the early 20th century, as intelligence testing became formalized and institutionalized, the absence of enslaved populations from foundational studies was reframed as a virtue. Scholars argued that prior assessments had been compromised by unequal conditions and should not inform modern science. This argument carries a surface logic, but it obscures a deeper continuity. The problem had never been unequal conditions. It had been inconvenient. By excluding certain populations from study, the system ensured that its categories would remain intact. Intelligence would be measured where it confirmed expectation, not where it challenged it. The ledger, meanwhile, remained sealed. When archivists encountered it during routine audits, they noted its existence without opening it. The classification discouraged curiosity. The handwriting, archaic and inconsistent, suggested effort without reward. It was easier to leave it untouched, yet even unopened, the ledger exerted a quiet pressure. Its mere presence catalogued, but inaccessible, testified to a deviation that had been managed rather than resolved. There is one additional detail that complicates the narrative. In the back of the ledger, separated from the assessment tables by several blank pages, there is a list of names. Not units. Not subjects. Names. They are written in a different hand, likely by a clerk rather than a researcher. The list is incomplete. Some names are crossed out. Others have question marks beside them. Unit 14 does not appear, but several of the names correspond loosely to earlier designations, phonetic similarities, repeated initials, a sense of approximation. This suggests that at some point, perhaps during the reclassification, someone attempted to reconcile the abstract units with actual individuals. Why? This effort was abandoned is not recorded. Perhaps it proved too difficult. Perhaps it proved too revealing. What remains clear is that the forbidden nature of the test was not inherent in its content. There was no single question that crossed a moral line. No apparatus that shocked or injured. No spectacle that demanded outrage. The horror, such as it is, lies in the restraint. In the careful observation of children who were never meant to be observed as thinkers. In the quiet realization, documented and then suppressed, that the system's assumptions did not hold under scrutiny. And in the decision not to destroy the evidence, but to preserve it in a form that ensured it would never matter. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world that had produced the Virginia assessment transformed itself. Laws changed. Institutions rebranded. Language evolved, but the logic that governed the ledger endured. Knowledge. The threatened structure is not refuted. It is archived. It is sealed. It is rendered inert through procedure. And somewhere, beyond the reach of those procedures, the descendants of those children inherited a system that had already decided what could be measured, what could be taught, and what would remain unspoken, unexamined and quietly present, waiting for a moment when someone might once again open a ledger and begin to read not for confirmation, but for what had been deliberately left incomplete, where a sentence breaks off, where a designation changes mid-line, where a refusal is noted without consequence, and where a child identified only by a number pauses before answering, as if considering whether the question itself deserves a response, as if aware, in some inarticulate way, that to speak too clearly within a system built on silence is to invite a different kind of erasure, one that does not announce itself, one that occurs not through violence or decree, but through the simple administrative act of deciding that this particular observation, this particular response, this particular mind, does not belong in the record at all, and therefore must be set aside, not destroyed, not denied, but filed away under a category whose meaning is never explained, whose implications are never taught, and whose contents remain sealed until such time as someone is willing to accept that the most disturbing truths are not those that shock the senses, but those that persist quietly in the margins, unfinished, unresolved, and still capable of being read. If one is willing to continue where the ink begins to fade and the line ends without the final word, that trailing absence, the place where the sentence never resolves, becomes its own kind of testimony. In archival practice, incompletion is usually treated as error, a missing page, a damaged folio, an interruption caused by time or neglect. But in the case of the Virginia ledger, the incompletion is too consistent, too patterned, to be accidental. Lines end just before conclusions, summaries stop short of. Interpretation. Observations are recorded without synthesis. It is as though the document itself has been trained not to say too much. When the ledger was eventually reopened briefly, cautiously, it was not by a historian of slavery, nor by an educational theorist. It was consulted by an archivist tasked with consolidating 19th century medical materials whose classifications no longer aligned with modern cataloging standards. The archivist's notes survive? They are administrative, procedural, and notably restrained. There is no commentary on the content itself. Instead, the notes focus on questions of placement. Does this constitute medical experimentation? Is this pedagogical observation? Does this fall under population studies? Each question is followed by a pause, then a deferral. The archivist recommends retaining the existing classification, citing historical sensitivity and interpretive risk. The ledger is returned to storage. The risk, notably, is not defined. Risk implies consequence. To whom, then, would consequence accrue? The children are long dead. The institutions have dissolved or transformed. The laws that permitted the assessment have been abolished. On the surface, there is no one left to be harmed. And yet, the ledger remains sealed. This suggests that the risk is not retrospective. It is ongoing. What the Virginia assessment threatens is not a specific reputation or doctrine, but a continuity. It exposes an early moment when the system almost acknowledged something it could not later disavow: modern intelligence. Testing rests on a narrative of gradual refinement. Early efforts are portrayed as crude but well-intentioned, hampered by limited tools rather than flawed assumptions. Progress in this telling is linear and corrective. The ledger complicates this narrative. It shows that from the beginning, there were moments of clarity, moments when the data did not align with the hierarchy, moments when the observers noticed and chose, deliberately, not to pursue. Unit 14's repeated assessments are particularly revealing in this regard. They suggest that the observers recognized an anomaly worth investigating. They returned to him not out of indifference but curiosity. They altered tasks. They refined questions. They watched closely. This was not negligence. It was attention, and attention, once given, creates responsibility. The ceiling of the results can thus be understood as an attempt to resolve that responsibility without addressing its cause. There is a memorandum attached to the ledger, dated several years after the original assessment. It appears to be a response to an internal inquiry, perhaps prompted by a change in administration or an audit of restricted materials. The memorandum summarizes the project in neutral terms, emphasizing its historical context and limited scope. It concludes with a recommendation that the materials be preserved for completeness, but not integrated into contemporary discourse. The phrase "not integrated" is telling. Integration would require interpretation. Interpretation would require acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would require explanation, and an explanation would invite questions for which the system has no satisfactory answers. 1. Such question concerns instruction. The prevailing justification for excluding enslaved populations from intelligence studies was that their lack of education rendered results meaningless. Without formal schooling, so the argument went, there could be no valid measure of cognitive capacity. The Virginia assessment undermines this logic. The children were not instructed. They were not trained. They were not coached. The tasks were designed specifically to avoid reliance on prior knowledge. Shapes, patterns, and narratives stripped of cultural markers, and yet some responded in ways that suggested structured reasoning. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that instruction was never the prerequisite it was claimed to. That the system's insistence on ignorance was, in part, a protective measure. Another question concerns refusal. In later intelligence research, non-response is typically coded as failure. A blank answer is treated as absence of ability. The ledger treats refusal differently. It distinguishes between confusion and withholding. This distinction is subtle but profound. To withhold is to exercise judgment. To recognize that a question is flawed or that an answer is being demanded under conditions that do not warrant cooperation. Such a capacity disrupts the tester-tested relationship. It introduces agency where only compliance was expected. There is no indication that the observers fully grasped the implications of this distinction, but they recorded it. The children who participated in the assessment did not leave written records. Their lives continued within a system that documented them only insofar as they produced labor or required control. But systems, even rigid ones, are porous. Information leaks. Practices adapt after the assessment. Overseers in the region begin to report changes in behavior among certain children. These reports are scattered, anecdotal, and filtered through hostile perspectives. Terms like calculating, withdrawn, and overly deliberate appear in plantation correspondence. Such traits are framed as problem signs of insubordination or sullenness, but the language echoes the assessment. Notes, delay, restraint, withholding. It is impossible to determine whether these reports refer to the same individuals, but the parallel is suggestive. And in recording it, they created a trace that could not be fully erased. If the assessment did not change the children's capacities, it may have altered the system's perception of them. To observe someone thinking is to become aware of the limits of control, and awareness breeds unease. The ledgers continued. Sealing also reflects a broader pattern in how institutions manage inconvenient precursors. When later frameworks claim novelty or neutrality, earlier deviations must be minimized or obscured. The Virginia assessment represents a path not taken, a moment when intelligence testing could have developed differently, acknowledging variability without hierarchy, capacity without entitlement. That it did not is not due to ignorance. It is due to choice. There is a temptation, when encountering such documents, to search for redemption. To imagine that the ledger's preservation, however restricted, constitutes a form of justice. That the truth, once recorded, will eventually assert itself. The ledger resists this optimism. Its preservation has not led to reckoning. Its existence has not altered curricula. Its contents have not been taught. Instead, it has functioned as a controlled anomaly, contained, contextualized, and neutralized through administrative distance. And yet, the ledger persists. Paper outlasts intention. Ink, even when faded, retains form. The children's responses, reduced to marks and notes, remain legible. They do not argue. They do not accuse. They simply exist. Near the end of the ledger, just before the blank pages that separate the assessment tables from the list of names, there is a short paragraph written in the same hand as the earliest entries. It appears to be a reflection rather than a report. The paragraph reads, "It may be observed that in the absence of instruction, certain faculties do not diminish but reorganize, suggesting that the mind, when denied formal cultivation, does not remain inert but adapts its operations to conditions of constraint. There is no attribution. No date. No follow dash up. The paragraph is neither cited nor refuted in later notes. It stands alone. This observation, modestly phrased, undermines an entire ideology. If the mind adapts under constraint, then deprivation does not prove inferiority. It proves endurance, and endurance, when recognized, demands a response. The system's response was to ensure that this observation would not circulate, that it would not be debated, that it would not become foundational. The ledger was sealed not because it was sensational, but because it was quietly radical. As the modern reader encounters these pages, the question is not whether the assessment was ethical. By contemporary standards, it was not. The more difficult question is why, having recognized its implications, the system chose preservation over confrontation, why it allowed the evidence to survive only in a form that guaranteed its irrelevance. Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of institutions themselves. They are capable of memory without reflection. They can store without learning. They can archive without understanding. And in doing so, They create a past that is technically intact but functionally inaccessible. The Virginia ledger is such a past. It waits not for discovery, but for willingness to read what was recorded without expectation, willingness to accept that the most dangerous knowledge is not that which provokes outrage, but that which quietly reveals that the foundations were always less certain than claimed. And somewhere within that willingness lies the recognition that Unit 14 was never anomalous, that he was simply one of the few whose responses were written down carefully enough, whose pauses were noted rather than punished, whose refusals were recorded rather than erased, and whose presence, reduced to a number, still exerts a pressure on the margins of the page, inviting the reader to continue, to follow the incomplete line forward into the silence it anticipates, where the ledger ends not because there is nothing more to say, but because what remains to be said would require a different kind of record altogether, one that does not categorize, does not seal, does not recommend non-replication, but instead confronts the fact that the test was forbidden not because it failed, but because it worked, and because its results, once acknowledged, could not be contained within the structures that demanded their own permanence. What follows that recognition is not reform, but management. Institutions rarely collapse when confronted with contradiction. They adapt. They reframe. They distribute responsibility until no single point of accountability remains. The Virginia assessment was absorbed in this way, not confronted directly, but diffused into procedure, language, and time. By the mid-19th century, the Commonwealth's educational and medical authorities had learned a valuable lesson. Certain questions, once asked, could not be safely answered within existing hierarchies. So, the questions themselves were altered after 1847. Intelligence research in the region began to emphasize trainability rather than capacity. Scholars spoke of aptitude for instruction, receptivity, and moral development. These concepts allowed for variation without threatening inequality. 1. Could argue that a population was capable of improvement, without conceding parity, capacity, could be acknowledged conditionally, equality, could remain unspoken. This shift is subtle but decisive. It marks a retreat from measurement toward prognosis. Rather than asking what the mind could do, researchers asked what it might become under supervision, under guidance, under control. The Virginia assessment had asked the wrong question, and it had done so too, honestly. Within this revised framework, enslaved children reappear not as thinkers but as objects of moral concern. Religious tracts discuss their souls. Agricultural manuals discuss their habits. Legal codes discuss their status, but their cognition remains abstracted. They are discussed, never examined, observed, never tested. The ledger's lesson is not forgotten. It is operationalized. Unit 14, by this time, has disappeared from all records. If he survived into adulthood, he did so under a different designation, perhaps under multiple designations as ownership changed. His earlier participation in the assessment leaves no trace. Beyond the ledger itself, this absence is often cited as evidence that the assessment had no lasting impact on the subjects, but impact need not be symmetrical to be real. The system changed its behavior. That changes the evidence. There is a tendency, when examining such documents, to focus on intent. Were the observers malicious? Were they conflicted? Were they progressive for their time? These questions, while understandable, risk missing the more consequential issue. Intent did not determine the Outcome. Structure. Did. The observers operated within a framework that allowed curiosity but not consequence. They could notice the anomalies but not follow them. They could record deviation but not integrate it. When the results challenged the framework itself, the framework prevailed. The sealing of the ledger was not accompanied by outrage or protest. There are no letters of dissent, no resigned positions. No recorded objections. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. The decision to suppress the findings was unremarkable. It required no justification beyond institutional comfort. In later years, as debates over emancipation intensified, intelligence was invoked frequently, always abstractly. Arguments about readiness, civilization, and capacity circulated widely. None referenced empirical data from enslaved populations. The absence was strategic. To introduce such data would have complicated the moral clarity of the debate, forcing acknowledgement of individual minds rather than collective abstractions. The ledger, had it been opened, would have demanded specificity, and specificity is dangerous to systems built on generalization. There is a moment late in the 19th century when the ledger nearly re-enters discourse. A reform-minded educator, reviewing archival materials for a comparative study, notes the existence of early observational data on dependent youth. He requests access. The request is denied. The justification cites contextual misalignment and risk of anachronistic interpretation. The language is protective, almost paternal. It assumes that the past must be shielded from the present, or perhaps that the present must be shielded from the past. By the time intelligence testing becomes formalized in the early 20th century, the categories are already hardened. Tests are standardized. Populations are sorted. Results are used to justify policies ranging from education to immigration to sterilization. The Virginia assessment, had it been integrated, would not have prevented these developments, but it would have complicated them. It would have introduced doubt at the foundation, and doubt, once institutionalized, is difficult to contain. The ledger's quiet endurance thus serves a dual function. It preserves evidence, and it preserves denial. By keeping the evidence inaccessible, the system can claim continuity without accountability. It can present its later frameworks as inevitable evolutions rather than selective constructions for the modern reader. The temptation is to break the seal symbolically, to read the ledger as an act of resistance, to reclaim the voices embedded in its margins. But resistance is not guaranteed by attention alone. The ledger does not offer redemption narratives. It does not provide closure. It does not restore agency to those it reduced to units. What it offers instead is a mirror. In that mirror, we see how easily knowledge can be neutralized, not through destruction, but through classification. How truth can be preserved in form while erased in function. Systems learn not by correcting themselves, but by refining their silences. The final pages of the ledger are blank. Not torn out. Not damaged. Blank. This blankness has been interpreted as unfinished work or as evidence of abrupt termination. But there is another possibility. The blank pages may have been left intentionally as a buffer, a space where nothing further would be recorded, ensuring that the observations already made would not be contextualized or explained. Silence here is not absence. It is designed. The ledger ends, then not with a conclusion, but with an instruction. Do not continue. Do not integrate. Do not replicate. Do not teach. And yet, the very act of sealing creates the conditions for Eventual reopening. Every archive carries within it the possibility of disobedience. Someone, at some point, will read what was not meant to be read, not out of malice, but curiosity, not out of outrage, but patience. They will notice the repeated assessments, the careful phrasing, and the distinction between inability and refusal. They will notice Unit 14 not as an anomaly, but as a signal. What they will do with that recognition remains uncertain. The ledger does not instruct the future. It only waits. Waiting, like withholding, is a form of judgment, and judgment, once exercised, cannot be undone. It can only be deferred. Deferred into procedure, deferred into policy, deferred into the margins of a book that ends without resolution, inviting the reader to decide whether the unfinished line represents an ending or an opening, whether the refusal to conclude is an act of suppression or an inadvertent preservation of possibility, whether the silence that follows is empty or charged, and whether the most unsettling aspect of the forbiddance test is not that it revealed intelligence where none was expected, but that it demonstrated how quickly a system, once confronted with such evidence, can choose to continue as though it had never been observed at all, carrying forward its categories, its hierarchies, its tests and classifications, while the unanswered questions remain filed away, intact and unread, waiting for a moment when someone is willing to ask not what the test proved, but why its results were sealed, and what it would mean even now to unseal them fully, to allow the incomplete sentence to continue beyond the page, beyond the archive, and into a reckoning that has been postponed not because it is impossible, but because it would require a willingness to accept that the foundations of knowledge were never as stable as they appeared, and that the true inheritance of the Virginia assessment lies not in the data it produced, but in the enduring institutional habit of deciding, quietly and without announcement, which questions may be asked, which answers may be recorded, and which minds are permitted to exist within the record at all, as the line continues, unbroken, into the space where the ledger ends and the responsibility to read, to question, and to respond begins, not with certainty, but with the recognition that the story does not conclude here, that it cannot conclude, because to conclude it would be to repeat the original act of closure, to seal the record once more, rather than to sit with the unresolved, the unfinished, and the uncomfortable awareness that the most consequential truths are those that remain suspended, waiting for a reader who understands that continuation is not a matter of adding words, but of accepting what follows when the silence is finally allowed to speak. And the question, long deferred, is no longer whether the intelligence test was forbidden, but whether we are prepared to confront what it revealed and what it still reveals about the systems that chose to seal it, and about the present moment that must decide whether to continue